because this day gets to celebrate children and the challenges that the African child gets to face in the African setup. And maybe we could start with just education in itself, which was the main reason as to why this day came alive. Looking at the years that have passed since and even today, what are some of the challenges that even from where you sit you have seen that have cut through time and still continue to be a problem that faces the African child in terms of education?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a number of challenges that face the African child. But before we actually even get into the actual challenges, I think it's critical to note that the international community has always reserved a pride of place for the child.
Yes.
And maybe before we even get into the history of the international legal instruments that protect children, it's critical to note that way back in 1924, there was a declaration on the rights of the child. The founder of Save the Children, a lady called Eglantine Jebb, actually took an instrumental role in drafting that 5-point charter way back in 1924 that raised a lot of issues to do with how the rights of children would be protected. And this went way into 1959, second declaration. And in 1979, the international community actually began drafting what we now call the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is one of the most ratified instruments, legal instruments ever in the history of the world. But back to the African child, after the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted in 1989, African countries actually relooked at that instrument and realized that a lot of issues that bedevil the African child had not been addressed in that particular instrument. And so they came up with what we call the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which isolates quite a number of what we call Africa-specific issues to deal that relate to children. Education, like you've mentioned, is one of the challenges that an African child faces. The reason being that we've seen African governments, many African governments don't invest actively in education. Well, Kenya is one of the countries that are said to invest heavily in education. If you look at the budget speech that will be read today, you'd realize that education gets quite
prioritized.
Gets quite prioritized. But quite a number of African countries don't actually do that. And that has a ripple effect on so many things. If you go around, particularly public schools, maybe in Nairobi it might be different, but if you go to most of our rural areas, I mean, I've seen KBC even bring out stories that show that we have very dilapidated buildings.
The quality of education now comes into question.
Yeah. Issues around the pupil-teacher ratio, particularly in our public schools with the advent of the free primary education. Issues around school fees for children. I know that we talk about education being free and compulsory, both under the Basic Education Act and under the Children's Act, but that is still a challenge because there are a lot of hidden costs that would then militate against the desire to have the free primary education policy implemented. So there are quite a number of challenges ranging from infrastructure to teacher-pupil ratio to hidden costs, and all that compromise access to quality basic education as we know it under the Constitution, the Children's Act, and the Basic Education Act.
And what more do you feel needs to be done in terms of just relooking the quality of education? In as much as education, yes, there is the 100% transition from primary to secondary, but that's just one of the factors when it comes to education. Now, when it comes to the quality, what more needs to be done by the government, the parents, the international community, and all the relevant stakeholders to ensure that the African child is not just getting education, but quality education at that?
Yeah, quality education, there are quite a number of issues. I'm sure our viewers know that we still have discussions around the curriculum. There's been a lot of push
back
and
and
pull
forth,
between the teachers' unions and the Ministry of Education, and the parents are actually in between. So I think in terms of actually concretizing those issues, all the relevant stakeholders need to come together and agree on what is workable for the Kenyan child. And then there's also the issue around investment in children, particularly in the education sector. I mentioned that if you look at the budget of Kenya, close to almost 20% goes into education. But one thing that needs to be looked at in that context is the balance between what we call recurrent and development votes within the Ministry of Education budget. You find that it's still very heavy on recurrent. Most of the money that is being allocated actually goes into payment of salaries.
Recurrent expenditures.
Yeah, recurrent expenditures within the education vote. So they might be need to also relook at the balance so that we invest more in development and also so that we can now take care of, the softer issues that we talked about, like the infrastructure in schools, so that we do not have situations where children are learning under trees. And and certainly you've seen from our media cases where children do not get that quality kind of education. So we need to see a reinvestment, particularly on development issues. We need to actually have we need to see a situation where parents are actually getting actively involved in the affairs of education.
Yes.
I think it's still a challenge in the sense that a lot of discussions happening around the education sector leave out the parents and even the children themselves participating in all this. So when you talk about issues of curriculum development, for example, one would wonder where where parents were in the course of all these discussions. So these are some of the things that need to be looked at in an attempt to make our education system better.
And you've just mentioned the other challenge that I want us to quickly look at, and that is child participation. Because just looking at the Soweto uprising back in '76, it was as a result of what the children were going through that they spoke up. The Black Education Act that was in place that segregated black children and white children was what they were going through. Now looking at the years that have come since 1991, where we get to celebrate the Day of the African Child, do you feel like the children are involved in these decisions that are made for them, that they're the ones who have to live with? Do you feel like they are involved enough in these decisions?
I think kudos to the government of Kenya in terms of ensuring that we have public participation, but I think there is still a lot that needs to be done. I know the Department of Children's Services, the Ministry of Education have been very vocal in terms of ensuring that we have platforms for children to participate. So we have platforms like the Kenya Children's Assembly. We have platforms like the student councils and the student governments under the Ministry of Education. And those are very useful platforms because if Save the Children works across 120 countries, and Kenya is one of the models in terms of public participation, in terms of child participation. But there's still a lot of ground that has to be covered for us to actually optimally realize the right to children to participate. So we need to see these platforms being, resourced so that we can see children participating. I think those of us who grew up a couple of years ago know that these platforms were non-existent. We didn't have we kept on saying that children were only there to be seen and not to be heard. But I think things are now changing. We are seeing children platforms actually coming up. But even as these platforms come up, there's always a balance between child rights and responsibilities of a child. So that you're not just focusing on equipping this child about their rights, but you're also tampering that with reminding them that they also have responsibilities. Because it would be foolhardy to get children who are so radicalized in the sense of, militant
knowing
action.
Their rights.
Knowing their rights without knowing their responsibilities. It would become, homes would become ungovernable. So even as we support children to participate and exercise their rights, we also tamper that with reminding them that they actually have responsibilities. And that is the whole essence of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which is a key distinction between the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a global instrument, and the African Charter, which emphasizes on duties of a child. So even as we promote child participation and insist that we need to see a reinvestment in child rights platforms, we also want to see issues around duties and responsibilities of a child being promoted. And also talking about platforms, I think our county governments, we've also been engaging our county governments to ensure that they also support these child participation platforms at the county level. And these child participation platforms can actually be useful vehicles for children to engage in public participation. We have seen children actually raising very pertinent questions and saying that if you're going to have a public participation exercise around, say, budgeting at the county level, and you don't involve children, and we know that children constitute more than 50% of the population in Kenya, then what you're essentially saying is that you are having public participation to the exclusion of close to 50%. So if our governments are supposed to be responsive, then they're also supposed to engage children in public participation and utilize the mechanisms that we've talked about to actually reach out to children.
Yes, because I believe you never know how to address a problem unless you hear from the person who actually is going through that problem.
Exactly.
Now let's look at this. The other factor that still poses a big challenge to the Day of the African Children and the African children as a whole is culture, and not just culture but retrogressive cultural practices.
Yes.
Let's start with the boy child for that matter. Since time immemorial, the boy child has been prioritized in terms of, progressing in life as opposed to the girl child. But it gets to a point where they are denied the opportunity to go to school and recruited for other activities, and some even in militia groups, extremist groups, just, which keeps them out of school. And just looking at some recent stats, which I think you also have, out of the 57 million, at least 57 million children around the world who are out of school, half of that is in Africa. And why? Due to the this retrogressive cultural practices that are happening when it comes to the boy child, being denied the opportunity to go to school and recruited to other activities that are retrogressive and counterproductive. Do you feel that we have made progress from where you stand? Have we made progress over the years, looking at the boy child specifically?
Yeah, I think in terms of issues relating to the boy child, I think there's been a lot of debate around the balance between the girl child and the boy child. But I think, yes, we can say that we've made progress. But like you're pointing out, there are a lot of issues also to be looked at, even as we celebrate the kind of progress that we've made over time. Because the boy child still experiences a lot of challenges. You've rightly pointed out aspects around recruitment into armed conflict. And you might think that this is not a problem for Kenya, because whenever we talk about recruitment into armed conflict, the quick response that comes to fore is that that is supposed to be for war-torn countries. But look at the kind of recruitments that are happening. I mean, I think last year, or was it the year before, we saw teachers being convicted for actually engaging into radicalization processes where children were actually being radicalized to join some militia groups across our borders. And so this is not just a challenge for war-torn countries. Even as a country, we're supposed to sit back and reflect and ask ourselves what is happening in terms of children being recruited to militia groups like Al-Shabaab. A couple of years we had like the Mungiki militia group. We had, I think, close to 10 years ago, we had the Sabaot Land Defense Force. And we had cases where children were actually conscripted into SLDF, the Sabaot Land Defense Force. And some of them were actually charged in courts with the offense of promoting warlike activities. And the Attorney General had actually to step in and enter a nolle prosequi in respect to those children. So the issue of recruitment of children into armed conflict is not entirely an issue of war-torn countries. But as a country, we are also supposed to reflect on how this is happening. Now, there are also issues around child labor. Yes. Again, looking at issues of cultural practices that are not up to speed. We've noted that a lot of children are also recruited into child labor, particularly what you'd call worst forms of child labor. And when we talk about worst forms of child labor, there is an ILO Convention number 182 of 1999, which singles out 3 worst forms of child labor. They talk about the kind of labor that would compromise the right to these children to access education, which we've talked about. they talk about labor that would compromise their health, and they also talk about labor that would compromise their morals. So we have instances where children have actually been involved in worst forms of child labor in this country that compromises their health, their education, and their morals. And all these are actually retrogressive cultural practices that would have an impact on the boy child. You also look at some of our pastoral communities where we still have practices like cattle rustling. You go to some of those communities, and
it's the young
boys. It's the boy child, 12-year, 13-year-old boys actually wielding guns and going out there to actually engage in cattle rustling, because we have some communities that still believe that for you to be a total man, or a man, so to speak.
Rites of passage.
Yeah, it's part of rites of passage. You must go out there, raid, and get animals so that you can actually announce to the whole world that you have arrived as a man. And so these are some of the things that actually compromise the rights to the boy child.
Yes. And now let's quickly look at some of the ones that face, the girl child, even as we talk about the boy child, that have, continued to be a problem since way before we were here.
Yes.
Now, the biggest one still remains early marriages for our young girls, sexual violence against them, both physically, mentally, and emotionally as well. What progress has been made towards this? And in terms of, yes, the rates have gone down, but it still poses as a challenge. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's still a major challenge, like you've rightly pointed out. A lot of progress has been made, but we still have a lot of challenges. The progress has actually been at the policy and legal framework perspective, because if you look at the policy and legislations that this country has enacted to protect some of those issues that you've talked about, female genital mutilation, for example, we have a wonderful policy framework. We enacted the Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Act, which criminalizes the aspect of FGM. It goes ahead to even establish an institutional framework in the name of an FGM board. But a lot of challenges still evident, even with the enactment of that legislation. One, you realize that the FGM board in and of itself has not been properly funded to actually exercise its mandate. Number two, you realize that FGM is still rampant in communities that still practice it. So that in some communities, we actually are seeing staggering figures. The extent of close to 80% of the girls in some of those areas actually being subjected to this practice. And then number three, we're also seeing a shift towards how FGM is being done. Right now, we are talking of medicalization of FGM. We actually have parents who still firmly believe in this, that they would actually take their children to facilities.
Medical facilities.
Yeah, to actually
get the procedure done.
Get the procedure done. And these are things that are still there. Then the other aspect is also around the transboundary engagement. Some of these communities that practice FGM are actually within the borders. So the neighboring countries have actually not criminalized this practice. So what would then happen is a girl is transferred to a neighboring country where the practice happens, and once they undergo the ritual, then they can come back having undergone the ritual, and it becomes very difficult to even prosecute. And then the other challenges have also been around communities. We've seen instances where chiefs have actually been prosecuted, because you can imagine a chief as a leader at the community level is supposed to be at the forefront opposing some of these things, yet they are the ones who are actually promoting the vices. So community engagement is still a huge challenge insofar as this is concerned. We have the things that you've mentioned around early marriages. This is still a huge challenge.
Problem.
Last year, when the children were preparing to sit for KCPE, you saw that we had counties which were recording very bad statistics in terms of children actually,
pregnant
pregnant children,
candidates.
And we were just talking about candidates. We're not talking about children who are in class 5, class 6, class 7.
They are known.
Yeah, they are known.
Yeah.
The cases that the media actually documented were largely
the candidates.
The candidates.
Yeah.
And when a survey was done, you actually find very mind-boggling figures in terms of children who have actually been made pregnant while they're in school. And so this is still a big issue. Again, it's a good thing to note that the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child addressed this issue specifically, and it noted that pregnant children should actually be given an opportunity to go back to school. And it's the same thing with the Basic Education Act, which has actually expressly provided for pregnant girls to be given an opportunity. Although across the border in Tanzania, you saw the president coming out so strongly to say that those pregnant girls, irrespective of how the pregnancy occurred, should not be given an opportunity, which I think most of us have noted that it was a step in the wrong direction. Yeah.
And it's definitely something that needs to be addressed, because just the other day we were having a discussion. It's one of the trending topics that we get to have here, where there was a mother who actually gave out her daughter, her 9-year-old, to be married off so that she can be able to feed the rest.
Exactly.
In other instances, we're having a discussion about, World Menstrual Hygiene Day, celebrated just the other day, where some girls have to involve themselves in sexual engagements at a very young age, just to be able to get some money to buy pads, and they end up getting pregnant because they do not know what they don't have the education they need when it comes to sexual reproduction and engagement. Right? And that actually brings me to my next point, and that is poverty, which still remains a big problem. Just as I'm saying, you have to involve yourself in one activity to be able to cater for the other activity. Having to marry off your daughter, who is 9 years old, to be able to feed the rest. Having to engage in sexual transactions just to get some money to be able to buy something as basic as sanitary towels. Poverty levels when it comes to, just protecting the children in the continent as a whole. Where do we stand as a continent?
Yeah, I think the bulk of discussions around failure to enforce or realize child rights, at the bottom line, poverty, is the bedrock.
Plays a very big role.
Poverty plays a big role in all this. And it's difficult to actually talk about how you can eradicate poverty. There are a lot of attempts by the government of Kenya in terms of just trying to address issues of poverty. So, for example, the Department of Children's Services has been trying to, do what we call a cash transfer program that targets orphans and vulnerable children. It started off as a very small program, but it has now graduated into a very big thing. And even as the Minister for Finance, the CS Finance will be reading his budget speech today, I would urge our viewers to actually look out for budget lines around cash transfer programs, whether these are around orphans and vulnerable children, the elderly, persons with disability, and so forth and so on. This will go a long way to actually address some of the challenges. But again, it's still a drop in the ocean because we are talking about a household being given probably 2,000 shillings in a month to address some of the challenges that exist. So in terms of programmatic actions by government, yes, we have made quite a lot of progress, but still a lot of challenges to be addressed. There's also, you talked about the issue of, say, sanitary towels. And civil society in Kenya have been engaging the government over the years on issues of sanitary towels and actually linking that to access to education. Because if a girl does not have sanitary towels, there are very high chances that she'll miss school.
For a few days of the month, every month.
So you can talk about, say, 4 or 5 days in a month. Cumulatively in a term, those are 12 days. In a year, those are...
It's actually at least a week?
Yes.
In a month?
Yes. So you can talk about close to you know, I mean, in a school term, you're talking about close to 15 to 20 days. Such a child will never catch up with the rest of the class. Now, there is a nexus between lack of sanitary towels and access to education. So it's not just a sanitary towels issue, but it's an access to education issue. And over time, organizations like Girl Child Network, you know, promoted this issue and took that campaign to a very high level until the government actually decided to actually ring fence certain funds in the national budget to actually address issues of sanitary towels for girls. But again, the media has actually pointed out instances where we still see a challenge in this, despite the fact that you know, that provision has been made in the budget. So it's true that poverty has played a significant role towards compromising the realization of child rights in Africa. But governments must strive to actually put in place programs that would then assist members of the community to actually, you know, to actually address some of these issues.
All right. Now, another big hindrance when it comes to the achievement of, you know, or the realization rather of the rights of the African children is the whole one of the biggest challenges, the whole question of safety and security as a result of, you know, war and conflict in some of the countries that here in Africa, which still remains a problem, leading to now the whole another issue to do with the refugees, which we'll be getting to in a moment. Now, when it comes to safety and security, what progress have we made as a continent since, you know, 1991 and even before that, in terms of even having a peaceful environment where children can be able to live and under their rights and freedoms?
Yeah, so Jen, that takes us to the theme of the Day of the African Child this year, because the theme of the Day of the African Child actually focuses on humanitarian action and humanitarian action in Africa. And the rallying call is that we should have children's rights first.
Yes.
We've had a lot of challenges on issues of safety and security for the African child. There's been a lot of instability in Africa, and most of it is actually political, because you find that as a result of political instability, we have you know, crises coming up. A good example is our neighboring country, Somalia, which, you know, from 1991 has been experiencing one form of crisis or another that has led to an influx of refugees into Kenya. And at one point, the Dadaab refugee camp was one of the largest camps in the world as a result of, you know, this crisis. So political crisis has contributed significantly to issues of humanitarian crisis. We know what is happening in South Sudan, and you can actually see now we have an influx of refugees into Kenya, particularly Turkana County, and into
the northern part of Kenya.
Into the northern part of Kenya. In Kakuma refugee camp. So, and for us, one of the biggest concerns is the bulk of the people who actually undergo the worst forms of torture are actually children. And you know, children have nothing to do with political crisis. They don't author political crisis.
Yes.
It's adults who actually author this. But children and
they suffer the consequences.
Yeah, children and women actually suffer the greatest brunt of the consequences around crisis. So that's why the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which is an institutional mechanism under the African Charter, actually came up with this theme to actually focus on particularly what we call man-made crisis that would affect children.
Yes. And you're just speaking of South Sudan as of, I think, Tuesday night. And you know, it's so sad that whatever is happening in South Sudan isn't getting as much international attention as it deserves. And just looking at the numbers that were coming in as of Tuesday night, I'll get to the recent ones, but as of Tuesday, there are about 500 people who were killed, 723 injured, 650 arrested, about 48 women had been raped, 6 men raped, and 1,000 still remained unaccounted for, and that was as of Tuesday. So the figures have definitely changed by today. I will be getting you those numbers before we wind up this conversation, so you can see, you know, man-made conflicts,
Yes.
which still pose a big problem, and the children get to suffer the most because, you know, there's separation, parents die, and the children are left as orphans and taken and catered for, no one to look after them, and they end up suffering and, you know, living such a miserable life because of the consequences of, you know, wanasemanga ndume wawili wakipigana ni nyasi huumia, and in this case it's the children who get to suffer, which of course poses one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the realization of the rights of the African child. And now the other issues now, natural disasters. It still is a big challenge, which still remains out of our control. But what can we do to just try and alleviate the problems that come as a result of natural disasters?
Yeah, and again, for natural disasters, again, in Africa, it's unfortunate that the abnormal has become the norm, in the sense that there's one crisis after the other.
Yeah.
And we talk about things like earthquakes, things like tsunamis. For us in Africa, one of the biggest ones is around drought. Certainly in Kenya, we saw that in 2007, in 2011, and we saw that in 2017. And there are a lot of lessons that we're supposed to have learned from that, but again, at times it looks like we don't even learn from those lessons.
Yeah.
We also experience natural disasters in the form of floods. So particularly in some of our northern counties, the shift is usually very interesting. At one moment, you're talking about drought. A couple of months down the line, you're talking about floods. And one wonders why we oscillate between these two extremes of floods and drought at the same time. Is there a way that we can come up with long-lasting solutions to actually address some of the issues? We talk about issues to do with diseases in terms of natural crisis.
Yeah.
So we've had epidemics in Africa, from cholera. Certainly in Kenya, we've been having these challenges this year, with certain counties experiencing issues of cholera. We've had things like in Mandera, for example, a couple of years ago, we had the chikungunya virus and so forth and so on. So you have diseases also coming in as natural disasters.
Yeah.
But one of the challenges that I think we need to be looking at, or the government needs to be focusing on, is to come up with durable solutions for some of this man-made and natural calamities.
Yes.
So, for example, on issues of drought, it's not just enough to work towards containing that, but also put in place measures and mechanisms that would ensure that there is food security for the populace. If we are talking about issues of diseases, I mean, some of them, like cholera, are just waterborne diseases that
issues, yeah.
we can get into preventative actions. It's saddening that in the 21st century, countries are still grappling with issues of cholera, which are primary healthcare issues that ought to have been fixed by our governments.
Ago, yeah.
So these are, and again, when we talk about disasters, when we talk about natural disasters, again, children bear the greatest brand. So look at what happened in 2017. Look at what is happening in some of our counties today, even as
just
we
as
sit
this year
here.
started, yes.
Yes. We've seen, the government, media, civil society organizations at loggerheads in terms of what is the real situation. We've had media houses saying that people have died as a result of hunger.
Yeah.
And the government coming out, loudly to say that this has not happened. And we've had instances where media, civil society have pushed the government to the level of saying, if the government cannot actually address this issue, why don't you declare it a national disaster so that you do two things. One, you have access to the consolidated fund, and then secondly, you can attract foreign support to actually help us mitigate against the pangs of hunger that actually the populace is actually suffering from. So the government needs to actually put in place measures to ensure that these natural disasters are actually contained.
Yes, yeah. I still find it, it's such a sad situation that not just in Kenya, but in the world over, we always experience some issues, but we never learn. We still resort to crisis management as opposed to, proactively putting in place measures that will be more preventative to avoid a crisis, because, these things happen.
Exactly.
That we're in Africa. We know the patterns. Yeah,
and Jen, like at times it's also very cyclic. There's always a pattern to it. You can always predict that we'll have floods in Budalangi at a particular time.
Yeah.
But the tragedy is we all sit and wait for the floods to happen, and then we all go there and purport to do one or two things instead of trying to find lasting solutions to some of the challenges that we have.
Yes.
And again, going back to budgetary allocations, if you look at the Public Finance Management Act, there is an expectation that each and every county is supposed to set aside a fund that they call an emergency fund.
Yeah.
Now, again, if you do a cross-section, if you do an analysis of counties that have actually set up emergency funds, you'd be shocked that some of our emergency-prone counties do not have legislations, do not have policies, do not have
any form of measures in place.
Yes, measures.
Yeah.
And let me just give an example of a county like Mandera, which is disaster prone, so to speak, because a couple of years ago we had the county actually experiencing what they called a chikungunya virus outbreak. There was a cholera outbreak. This is a county that is likely to experience, conflict situations by virtue of being actually sharing borders with Ethiopia on the other side, Somalia on the other side. And we've seen a lot of Al-Shabaab issues and children actually being recruited across the border, like we said. But I would be shocked to announce here that that county does not have an emergency fund, that does not have a county emergency fund. It does not have a legislation that is supposed to support it to actually, in accordance with the expectations of the Public Finance Management Act, to set aside money that can actually be used to respond expeditiously to a crisis.
Yeah.
And so when a crisis happens, they have to go back to their budget, they have to go back to the county assembly to actually do a supplementary budget to actually allocate funding for that. And that takes time, because the whole essence of having an emergency fund is so that you can tap into that fund very quickly and address the existing issues without necessarily,
having to go back to the drawing table.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm even just looking at the drought situation and the flooding. Just last year, the rains, the long rains between March last year and May, June therein, they were termed as the heaviest that we have experienced in the last 55 years. But come August, there was a food shortage. Why? Because we're still resorting to crisis management as opposed to proactively setting in place measures that, live through time, that will always be preventative as opposed to crisis management. Well, all this, just ultimately boil down to even the children, affecting how they get to experience their rights and freedoms, and consequently actually just diminishing, or rather limiting them experiencing the full potential and the full privileges that comes with the rights of the children, and not just in Africa but the world over. Because when you talk about the rights of children, in as much as this day is about the rights of children in Africa, there's so many problems that face children across the world that are not as vocally put out there by people who are in position to better speak these issues that affect the children on a very personal basis. And of course, we'd like for you to be part of this discussion using the hashtag Good Morning Kenya on Twitter. Our official station handle ever remains at KBC Channel 1, and we'll be checking in with Ram Aguko in a minute or so to see if he is ready. I don't know, Ram, are we set on the other side of studio?
All
right.
And, checking in on what people are talking about concerning the day of the African child. Remember, the hashtag also is DSC 2019 that, people have already started giving in their comments. Make sure that you also tag us at KBC Television, at Jane Obwe, and at Ram Aguko. And first things first here, because the day of the African child has, been put this year in order to increase the awareness, the theme being humanitarian action in Africa, children's rights first. There is a tweet here concerning what's happening in Sudan, and someone at Patoon4 says, strong words, Allah please help the people of Sudan. The words are, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And now here brings into perspective, how people can be able to take sides when it comes to standing in for the rights. Most people do not actually go in on full, by full force in order to choose which side they choose. And here we talk about being neutral in situations of injustices. Does it portray, give us a bad reflection about our society in order for us to be able, moving forward? How should we look at ourselves? Do we stand in for what is right? And if you don't stand in for what is right, then you choose to be on the side of the oppressor. All right? Here we have tweet here, children's right here. Despite, on the occasion of the June 2nd World Day Against Child Labor, in collaboration with the administrative unit number 6 here. All right. Another tweet, at least 100 African students were killed and thousands injured for asking to be treated as humans. Soweto, that is in June 16, 1976. Now, the question here is, how are the rights of African children protected today? And are they even protected in the first place? All right. So over to you, Jane. But before that, there is a tweet here. Government is committed to mitigating challenges faced by the Kenyan child. That is what P.S. Nelson Marwa said. And the question now comes in, based on what we are having, the state of education in the country. Are we really educating the Kenyan child? The debate has been there for quite some time. And, it's all about, meanwhile, talking about moving forward, the challenges faced by the Kenyan child in order to achieve, getting the education that he deserves. And one more tweet, that the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development had said that it has a primary mandate of ensuring the protection of all children in the ministry back in Uganda from all forms of abuse, neglect, violence, and exploitation. Those are the tweets so far that we have, and keep them coming in. The hashtag Good Morning Kenya on Twitter, at KBC Television, at Jane Omboy, and at Ram Aguko. Jane, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Ram, and thank you so much for your feedback on social media. Keep the hashtag going and blazing up. It still remains hashtag Good Morning Kenya on Twitter. And just from what we have had, the rights of we keep talking about the rights of children, the rights of children, the rights of children, but we're not getting down to what these rights are specifically. And maybe just you can briefly tell us, what are some of these rights of children that are frequently subject to being infringed here and there by people who have power in one divide or the other? What are these rights that are mostly violated for children?
Yeah, so in terms of the rights of the child that are violated, and that's why I began talking about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I also talked about the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which are the key instruments that articulate the rights of children.
Yes.
So there are several categories of these rights. We have a category that we call survival rights, which begin with one of the most important rights, obviously, the right to life. And the right to life is broad because it captures aspects of survival. So issues around health, for example, issues around access to health would be under that gamut. Then we also have development rights. Children are actually expected to be supported to develop. And so here we talk about issues around the realization of education, which we've talked about. We have protection rights as a category. Children are supposed to be protected from several things on account of their vulnerability. So we are talking about protection from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, for example. We're talking about protection from harmful cultural practices that you singled out. We are talking about protection from sexual exploitation. We are talking about protection from hazardous work. We are talking about protection from. I talked about issues around corporal punishment, for example.
Yes.
And then we have participation rights. The children are actually supposed to participate in matters that affect them.
Yes.
So issues around children actually having a voice. So these are, broadly speaking, 4 categories of rights, and each and every category of right has actually has its own consequences in terms of if it's not realized. Like issues around health. If we don't invest in sound, in proper health care, for example, and then we are bound to see the kind of challenges that we've seen in the area of health, like issues of high rates of malnutrition, a lot of children dying from preventable causes, and so forth and so on.
All right.
Issues around education we've talked about, issues around protection, issues around participation. All these things actually require a lot of investment. And I like the tweet that came from the principal secretary in charge of children affairs in this country, Mr. Nelson Marwa, who has actually taken a very active role in this by reassuring Kenyans that the government is keen and is still desirous of actually ensuring that the rights of children are protected and promoted all over Kenya.
And upheld, for that matter.
Yes.
Now, the theme for this year's Day of the African Child is humanitarian action in Africa, and just as you said, basing heavily on children rights first. Now, what does this day even mean? What should we expect come the 16th of June in terms of how this theme will be brought out?
Yeah. So there are 2 things that have happened. One is that normally in Kenya, we celebrate this day in 2 places. So there's normally a launch to the celebrations. So the launch happened last week on Friday in West Pokot County. And we had the governor of West Pokot and his entire team, together with the National Council for Children's Services, the Department of Children's Services, going down to actually promote this day in West Pokot.
Yes.
And one of the things that came out in the course of that launch, which happened on Friday last week, was that the government was very categorical in terms of reassuring Kenyans that they are keen, that the government is actually keen on the realization of child rights. And one thing that came out very strongly, particularly from the governor for West Pokot, Professor Lonyangapuo, was that the county government of West Pokot, and we know West Pokot is one of the counties that are most likely, would most likely be affected by this theme. When you talk about humanitarian crisis, the governor actually came out strongly to reassure the good people of West Pokot, and particularly the children from West Pokot, that the government actually looks at their interests.
Yes.
And then at the national level, we've seen the commitment by the principal secretary. He was represented there, and those commitments were actually made. Now, on the 16th of June, the national celebrations will actually be held in Tana River County.
Okay.
And again, the choice for the 2 counties, Tana River and West Pokot, resonates to the theme of the Day of the African Child
action,
on humanitarian action. So we are looking forward to a reassurance by the government on this particular day, and children need to, to look out for the assurances that would come from government on what the government proposes to do in order to further their rights.
All right. And as we bring the conversation to a close, what more do you feel, even we as the public, the parents, the teachers, all the relevant stakeholders, even our leaders in political and governance position, what more needs to be done in terms of sensitization and awareness of the Day of the African Child when it comes to the rights, the realization of the rights of children as a whole?
Yeah, so I think in terms of messaging, we would want to thank the government of Kenya for so far for what they have done. But again, I think it's critical to note that much as a lot has happened, there's still a lot of ground to be covered. It's important to appreciate that.
Yeah.
And so we would urge the government to continue investing in children. The budgetary allocations that you're talking about, both at the national level and at the county level, need to reflect some of the measures that would go a long way in ensuring that children enjoy their rights. We're also urging county governments to actually take a keener interest on issues of child rights.
Yes.
We are also urging members of the public to actually come out and look at the interests of children. Then for children themselves, we're asking them to continue being vigilant on the realization of their rights, but most importantly to also remember that they have responsibilities and duties both under the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child and the Children's Act.
All right.
Now, in terms of the African Committee of Experts, they have actually given an advisory on 3 issues. One, they have advised African governments to come up with strategies to ensure that humanitarian issues are addressed, and we've talked about it, in terms of putting in place policies and legislations that would that would ensure that child rights are actually implemented or rather realized during humanitarian crisis. They have also urged African countries to undertake voluntary national reviews on issues around national and at both national and subnational levels to monitor the protection of child rights on in cases of humanitarian emergencies. And they have also issued an advisory around refugee children. And Kenya is certainly a country that hosts quite a number of refugee children, so that refugee children's rights are actually upheld
addressed as well.
And addressed. All
right. So thank you so much, Ibrahim, for just coming through and just helping even me better understand what this Day of the African Child is all about. You as our viewer, from wherever you're watching us from, we do hope that you're better able to understand why this day is celebrated, and not just in Kenya, but the continent and the world over, to just make sure that the African child gets to enjoy his or her rights as, you know, they so deserve, you know. And of course, and also in commemoration of the children who, you know, bravely stood up for their rights in Soweto back in '76. There were over 10,000 black children who marched on the streets. It was about, I think, half a mile long, rather a mile long queue that they formed as we were marching to just fight for their rights, to do away with poor quality education and to be taught in their own language, which resulted to more than 100 of them being killed. 1,000 were injured, more than 1,000 were injured. And of course, we also remember Hector Peterson, who was at the forefront championing for the rights of the children. So come 16th June, this Sunday, please be sure to just read more about what this day is about and celebrate this day and help uphold the rights of all children in Africa and the world over. So thank you so much. We have been speaking with Ibrahim Alubala, who is the Advocacy and Child Rights Governance Technical Advisor working with Save the Children, all about saving the children, which, you know, as the organization's name so says. So remember, the theme still remains humanitarian action in Africa, children's rights first. So remember that children's rights come first. They are vulnerable, they are innocent, and they get to suffer the most when it comes to, you know, when big people fight, when adults fight, it is the children who get to suffer the most. Well, with that, that's that on this discussion, but keep it here. We have more fantastic discussions coming up. And remember, today the budget for the fiscal budget for the year 2019-2020 will be read out in Parliament by the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, Mr. Henry Rotich, which will be happening later on in the afternoon. And we are here to just help you better understand understand and get to know what are some of your expectations from this budget, given that there is a deficit of about 600 billion plus, 600 plus billion, and how that is going to be catered for. All that is coming up in not too long, so keep it here. The hashtag still remains hashtag Good Morning Kenya on Twitter. At KBC Television is our official station handle, and tag us as well at Ramaguko, at Raymond Nyara, at Doreen Arange, and myself at Jane Mamboy. See you after the break.